All right, we are live with episode 4. I just titled it Linux because I didn't want to narrow it down. We're going to talk desktop. We're going to talk, servers and distribution. So it's just Linux talk today. And this is Tom Lawrenson.
Jay LaCroix.
Yes. So a little quick housekeeping for those of you that have been following us since we started. Yes, it's a podcast now. And for some of you who are already listening to this sometime in the future, yes, it took a little bit longer than we were hoping to set this up. But the podcasts are live. You can find them at thehomelab.show. There's an RSS feed. We've got them published to places where podcasts are published, like Spotify and Apple and everywhere else. So we're easy to find. Everything is at thehomelab.show and, of course, the history of all the previous shows. All right, let's talk about Linux, because you can't build a home lab without Linux, I think, right?
Well, you can. I mean, I think that's a good place to start, actually. I mean, can you? Well, sure. Some people out there might just build a home lab because their company just is a Windows shop and they want an Active Directory server on VMware along with, some other servers. So there could be some people that, use Windows and some people that don't. I think it's probably true the majority is going to use Linux. It's just very, very flexible. It's almost like, just clay. You can mold it into whatever you want. And it's not to say you can't customize Windows, but you have a little bit less.
It's a lot more restrictive, and I am not saying you shouldn't have Windows in your home lab. Please, I'm not that person. In matter of fact, a lot of times home lab is frequently deeply driven by a need to learn, and if your need to learn is some of the Windows stuff, but I'm not positive whether or not me and Jay will at some time in the future do a Windows version. Like most of the time you use Windows out of necessity, not out of want. But Linux, people want to get into it. People want to dive into it. And like you said, the flexibility, the molding of it, especially when you've been playing with it as long as me and Jay have. And once you've learned how to compile your kernel, which now is a lost art. Like I couldn't do it anymore. Like I used to. That used to be kind of like a requirement. Like now it's not even something you can get started way easier in Linux now than you could 20 years ago.
It was a requirement for me because when I first started, I was, quite on the low end of income, I should say. And all my computers for many years were hand-me-down parts that I found. So I would have like several generations old computers, to put it lightly. And what I found is that compiling the kernel, I could just delete stuff I don't use. Oh, there's a bunch of AMD modules here. Well, I don't have an AMD system. Well, actually I did, so you could reverse that to Intel. Either way, delete the modules outright, make sure they don't load, and have a kernel that's stripped down and only has the stuff in it that I care about. It would take about 12 hours, I thought, or maybe longer to compile.
Oh, and the worst was like 11 hours into your 12-hour kernel compile when it would go wrong, and then you'd start over.
Actually, what's worse, in my opinion, is when it succeeds and then your computer doesn't boot because one of the things that you made as a module you shouldn't have, or worse, you have a required component that you just stripped out of the kernel that's required for your chipset. So it was quite a learning experience, not something that I would recommend anyone go through. Unless you want to learn like embedded development or kernel development, then you should absolutely do that. But nowadays, we can compile the kernel a lot quicker. But for home lab, that's probably not very many people are going to go and do that. I wouldn't think. So Windows, and to end that whole conversation, I will give them some benefit. They have come a long way since back in the day. I remember when I was totally enamored by LVM, Logical Volume Manager, for disks. I
confused is the word I use when I reference LVM.
Yeah. Well, but anyway, it's back then it was just so amazing that I could resize a file system, on the disk without shutting down the machine, assuming, of course, that there's some additional space there. And, a long time ago, I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's just going to show you how flexible Linux is. You could grow the file system online without shutting down the server and booting it. My understanding now, if I'm not mistaken, is Windows can do that now. And I think it has been able to do that for a while. I don't know for how long, but it's just the way it was. It's like we have these features in Linux and then they eventually make their way into Windows. But like Tom, I'm not that guy. Like if you use Mac, you use Windows, I have a Linux channel, right? So I could be accused of having some bias, but at the end of the day, you use whatever you like. You use whatever makes you happy, whatever fits your use case, and there's no judgment.
Yeah,
But given that I have a Linux, oh, sorry.
I was going to say that I see this, and I joke around about it, but there's too much. My friend, I've seen Craft Computing come up in the comments. Time he's great. He's got a lot of Homelab stuff as well, and people come at him sometimes in droves, and the Twitter army's like, "You need to use Linux. You can't. You're doing something in Windows," and he's like, "So."
Yeah, and I'm right there with you. I use Linux because I love it and I enjoy it. It's a subject of my hyperfocus. I have my ADHD shirt on, by the way. But hyperfocus is a symptom of ADHD. I'm mostly kidding, but I might not be. So I focused on Linux because I just thoroughly enjoy it, and people kind of, as I've said before in the podcast, people can accuse us of being fanboys, and maybe to some extent that's true. But when you're doing a passion project or a creativity project, you kind of tend to cater more towards the thing that you're into. So Linux is, when we decided to talk about it, I'm like thinking, yeah, that is a great topic. Well, I mean, of course it is for me, right? I have a book, or actually 5 books, 3 versions of Mastering Ubuntu Server is out, has been published, and a few books before that. And then the YouTube channel. So I have no shortage of knowledge there. So I figured maybe I could say a few things about Linux and help the audience understand some things about it that they may not have understood, talk about some distributions, pros and cons, the differences, and so on, and then we can just go from there.
And we should probably start with which distribution should you choose, and I'll duck some hate in the comments. this is the hot topic, right?
It really is, and one of the things that I want to get out of the way too is a question I get asked a lot. What is the difference between a server distribution and a desktop distribution? The answer is nothing. Well, that's not completely true. The short answer is nothing. It's a Linux kernel. Both the desktop distribution and the server distribution have the Linux kernel. So it's Linux either way. The difference is what software is bundled with it. And a server distribution, generally speaking, is not going to have as much bundled with it because it wants to stay out of the way for your workloads. You have something running, maybe you have a web server, you're serving a website. If you're running the GNOME desktop on there, it may not make a big difference nowadays, but there was a time where just having a login manager, display manager, if you will, running in the background, and a display manager is what handles visual login, a graphical user interface. It just was a waste of CPU cycles. So generally speaking, it's very common that you don't have a GUI. That being said, I also understand there's beginners out there that kind of need that because they're not there yet. And I did require the GUI when I first started, and then I became self-sufficient on the command line. But no judgment if you run a desktop. A lot of people do. And you might even run a virtual desktop. Think about it. You have a server on your Homelab that is running a desktop environment, and you use something like X2Go to connect to it to have a desktop in your hypervisor. So yeah, maybe you'll have a desktop environment then. That's the main difference. The absence or implied absence of a desktop environment doesn't mean you can't run one. So when we look at Ubuntu Server, for example, which is a perfect example of this, that's the difference. You install Ubuntu Server, and then later on you want a desktop environment, you could just install the Ubuntu-desktop package. Install that one package, and it'll bring in a bunch of dependencies and pretty much convert it into a desktop.
And this is where I think the lines can get blurred a little bit more. I mean, we're used to the concept in Windows, like there's a server version and a home user, or not home user, but a desktop environment version. And it gets a little bit more blended in Linux because there are some maybe server applications, or you can say this is a dedicated server for a thing, but it may need a UI to help control those things. So the lines are super blurry in Linux. It really comes down to how you label it. I mean, obviously, if you're going to use it for multimedia editing, I wouldn't call it a server. It's just kind of a label, and it doesn't have the same strength and meaning because it's not like it has to be separate. Because I can take a base server set up to do a specific function and still load some multimedia editing tools on it because the kernel is really what makes it Linux.
That's true. And to make it even more confusing, for a time, I used to run Ubuntu Server as my desktop distribution of choice. Why? Because it doesn't come with anything but the command line. So what I would do is just manually install each individual component, like the desktop environment, but not the entire desktop environment, not the theming, just the desktop base core minimal desktop with no added apps, and I would just add the things I wanted. I liked it. It was almost like the closest thing to the Arch Linux experience you can get on Ubuntu, technically. So that's basically the difference, is the absence or implied absence of a desktop environment. And now we could kind of get into the distributions and the pros and cons of each.
I'll let you start,
So,
because this is where
yeah, I was gonna
I'm just
say,
Debian.
yeah.
Like, I started in Red Hat, I moved to Debian, and my reason for staying there is because I've used it for 20 years and it works. So
And Debian is a great one to talk about. And again, there's pros and cons, but Debian is awesome. It is one of the oldest distributions, one of, if not the first distributions with a package manager, which to us now, it doesn't really seem like a big deal, right? Like every distribution has a package manager. You can use the command line to install a package. It brings in a bunch of dependencies. When I started, I had to figure out the dependencies myself. I didn't really have that luxury to where, oh, package A requires package B, C, and D, and so on. And it's just going to install them for me. I only have to install the one. But I literally had to remember what is a dependency of what when I started. And then there was a time where you could even run apt-get in Red Hat. They had a
I remember
version of
that.
apt. Yeah, isn't that crazy? Like they had a version of apt that somebody recompiled to support RPMs. It didn't last for very long, but it gave you that.
Yeah.
So a package manager may not seem like a big deal, and Debian kind of made that famous, in my opinion.
It was interesting, and referencing back to the what was earlier referred to as dependency hell, which when you had to install some of those RPM packages, getting the other dependencies to set something up, apt really solved that, and it's what brought me from Red Hat, where I started, and moved over to a Debian base, I should say, because I still like Ubuntu and I use Pop OS, but
Yep.
that Debian base and me being very familiar with apt, how to manage it, how to manipulate things in the system and get them set up, it really, I think, brought a ease of use. They were kind of like the gold standard, and still in some ways are. There's a lot of other competing systems that work very similar to apt now. Matter of fact, they had a apt, essentially you can look at the way that they distributed was very similar to the way we have app stores now. That, and this goes back to the very beginning concept of Debian. We just apt-get install, it would realize in the universe that is Debian and pull all the tools to put things together. We think about apps on our phone and things like that. That's the way Debian was formed long before the iPhone was invented or any of these
Right.
ecosystems we're used to now.
Like an app store before we had the concept of the app store.
Yeah.
And I remember using Synaptic on Debian for the GUI equivalent of that. So Debian, I do have some criticisms of Debian, which I'll get to, but I need to always talk about the positive first. And there's a lot of positive stuff to talk about when it comes to Debian, and it's really great on servers, especially. Um, and I'm going to get into an edge case that wasn't in a few minutes, but generally speaking, Debian's a good choice. Bottom line, regardless of my opinion, Debian's a good choice. Now, where Debian gets a little confusing for some is that some people refer to it as a rolling release. It's not. There's actually 3 different sub-versions of Debian. There's stable. So I use stable and just the blanket term Debian interchangeably. When I just say Debian, I'm mostly talking about Debian stable, which is the stable. I was going to say it's on a release schedule, but not really. They kind of release it when it's ready,
Yeah.
and which is great because if they think, oh, it's going to be out in a couple of months, maybe, or maybe there's going to be some bugs that they want to work out. They're not like Canonical with Ubuntu where they live or die by their release, like the release date. Ubuntu was late once that I ever remember. And a lot of people may not remember that, actually. They actually delayed a release once, just one time. But they have that release date and they stick to it. Debian is more like we'll release it when it's ready, which is a really great thing. And
Yeah.
stable, it doesn't update very often. I would say like, we're on version 10 right now with Debian Stable with 11 coming out, but we don't know when. It's probably going to be, first half of this year. I can almost promise you that. And that's awesome because you don't have to worry about, is it ready for prime time? Well, yeah, they wouldn't have released it if it wasn't ready. And then I want to say on average, something like 1.5 to 2 years is a new release, give or take. Some release windows were shorter than others. They have fewer bugs to fix, really what it comes down to. But then you have Debian testing, which is the next level, and it's semi-rolling. Now, when I say rolling, a rolling distribution, I'm sure almost all of you know this, but some of you may not. A rolling distribution has no release. It's like they just keep putting the new packages out there. So a new version of the GNOME desktop comes out. They just put it in the repository. Install your updates, you get the latest everything. Is generally what a rolling release is. And that's kind of what testing is with Debian. But the reason why it's not full rolling is because they have a freeze window where they stop. And it is a development towards a stable release, meaning Debian testing today will become the new stable. So Debian 11 today is Debian testing, but then at some point they freeze it, they fix the bugs, and then they change it to stable. And then the current Debian stable, now 10, becomes old stable. So that's kind of how that works. So testing is basically the new, or will be the new Debian stable. Then we have unstable, which is rolling because there is no freeze, as I understand it. They just keep throwing packages in there, but it's unstable. A lot of people argue that it's stable enough, that if you have a problem, you just wait. But I don't think anyone's gonna run unstable on their Homelab servers. And I think fewer, some people might run testing. I think stable is going to be the way most people go. I want to make that distinction clear about the 3 versions so everyone understands, when you choose Debian, you're probably choosing stable, but the other 2 versions exist as well.
Right. If you want some more cutting edge packages or cutting edge surprises that come with having the latest package, run unstable or testing.
Now, there's also the concept of a mixed Debian stable testing, which is where you add the testing repositories, but you give them a lower priority so that you're always pulling from stable. But if you need that new package, you can just grab it from testing. Last I checked, that's not supported. You can do it. Many people do. Many people have no problem with that. And a lot of desktop users will do that because they may need a new GUI app or something that isn't in the repositories, and they don't want to wait the 1.5 or 2 years until the next Debian comes out. They want that package right now, but they don't want all the packages updated to unstable or testing. They just want that one thing. Unless that's changed, then it's not supported, but you can do it, and I don't really recommend it. I just want to let people know that it exists in a concept because you'll hear other people doing it.
And not to get too far deep into it, but there's other options you have like Apt Pinning, which allows you to pin a specific version of software. And I've had to do this before, even with testing, because the new version was incompatible with another piece of software I ran on top of a framework. So I had to temporarily pin a version backwards. And as long as it's not a security risk to pin it to an older version, but it's a compatibility. And this happens again back to multimedia editing, which I've brought up because that's directly where you'll notice some of those problems, because like editing with the Kdenlive tool, it can be a nightmare before Flatpak and all that, but that's another episode before we talk about Flatpak.
Yeah, that's a little bit of controversy with those universal apps,
yeah, there's a lot of little details you can do to dive into is what I was trying to get at with the app tool with Debian, so you can kind of mix and match your system. Be careful because you can also create your own instabilities doing so.
Yes, and I've experienced that. There's also the Porch repository, which is supported, and it's released for stable. There's no schedule on that. Usually they have it out with each stable release around the time it comes out. And that allows the Debian developers to give Debian stable users some packages that they can freely install that are newer than what comes with Debian stable normally. And when I'll get into the downsides of that, but I just want to let everyone know that does exist. You could just install the Porch repository in stable. There's instructions on Debian for doing that. So if you are, for purposes of Homelab, you need a newer version of Apache, maybe it'll be in there, or whatever it is you're running. Maybe you'll have a newer version in the Porch repository. Now, downsides, because everything I said was upsides, right? You have all these different repositories and ways that you can configure your software, or you can ignore all of that and just use Debian Stable and not overcomplicate it and not even look outside of Debian Stable, and you'll be fine for the most part. So downsides, hardware compatibility, in my opinion, in Debian is one of the lowest of all distributions. Now, I know I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for this. Now, don't get me wrong on this. Debian is great, but more than any other distribution, I've had issues with compatibility where if you install it on a piece of hardware that just came out, most likely your hardware will not be fully supported. It'll be the next release of the distribution, which could be a few years away. So just think about it for a moment. And this has happened. And I'm going to actually just use a story that happened to me. A company I was working at a while back, we bought a brand new Dell Precision server. And corporate was very Microsoft centric. So they just had a contract with Dell. We didn't even have a choice over what model that we were going to purchase. I want to throw that out there. But Dell PowerEdge servers are pretty good, so I didn't really mind that. So I just grabbed Debian Stable, and this particular device, we were making a router / internet gateway device. So we had 2 gig NICs on here. Installed Debian Stable, didn't detect the network card at all. On a brand new server, the newest release of Debian didn't detect it. And we ended up going with Ubuntu on that one, even though we were normally a Debian shop. So sometimes hardware compatibility lags behind with Debian because when they release, let's say that Debian Stable came out today. So it was released on March 31st. That's not true, but let's just assume that. Then if a new chipset comes out on April 10th, chances are it's not going to have the drivers for it. It could work, but it's not going to know about hardware released in the future. That's the problem. And that's really a problem for all distributions. But Debian having a 2 or 1.5 to 2 year release window, sometimes that could be a problem. But if you don't have like the latest and greatest, you're probably not going to really run into a problem there. It is what it is. And the reason why they do this is Debian Stable means stable. They don't want the bleeding edge software in there by default. So you can also appreciate the fact that even though the hardware compatibility is a bit behind, it's stable. It's pretty rock solid. So you do get that benefit as well. It's a trade-off though.
Yeah. There are also lack of non-free repositories being defaultly available. And for things like NVIDIA, I mean, we can argue and hate on NVIDIA, and rightfully so, for not giving us good open source drivers. But I also have the realistic, I can complain about it, but I still have things to get done. So I need this NVIDIA card to work. And this is where Ubuntu has done a good job of just check this box for the non-free. And here we go. Now we're going to load those proprietary drivers. We know we all don't like the fact that they're proprietary. We can all agree on that. But we're surrendering to the fact that NVIDIA makes good video cards. And I need my video card to work. And Debian's very purist on that. And this is also what kind of hurts some of their driver support a little bit, you know, because like you said, there's ways you can enable it in Debian, but it's out of the box, not as simple to do.
Right. So one example of this, I'm going to use a laptop example, but you know, it still could happen to a server as well. My ThinkPad X1 Extreme, first generation, they're up to generation 3 as of now. The current stable version of Debian will not boot on it at all. There's just no way to get it to boot that I've found. Now a new user would throw up their hands and get frustrated. Now, if I put more time into it, could I get it working? Yeah, I could definitely get it working. But this is 2 generations ago. It doesn't work with this hardware. It's too new, but it's 2 generations ago. So let that sink in for a minute. A new release of Debian is right around the corner. Now, I installed Debian testing on it, and it's fine, perfectly fine. So one solution some people will do is if they have this problem, they'll run Debian testing, and then when it graduates to stable, they'll just keep going with stable, which is a good solution because you start with something that works, and then it becomes stable as you go. Sometimes you have to do that. But like Tom mentioned, there's some quirks with hardware compatibility that might frustrate new users. Intermediate or advanced users might not be put off by that. And also, like Tom said, yes, we all hate proprietary drivers. I do as well. But when it's time for me to play video games because I'm done working, I'm going to want to use my NVIDIA card to play Doom. And yeah, I understand I don't like NVIDIA. And if my computer has an NVIDIA card, yes, we could argue that AMD is better, and technically they are. But if my computer has an NVIDIA card and it's time for leisure time, I want to play some games. And yeah, I'm going to require a proprietary driver. As much as I hate to install it, it is what it is, unfortunately. It's our reality.
For sure.
So yeah, that's what we kind of run into. So I think those are the main downsides about it. Now, backports I feel like backports is a potential solution to a lot of the problems I mentioned, because they can add a new kernel, and they have done this to backport. So you can have a newer kernel with newer hardware support in there. It's just not really predictable. Like one release Debian, I can't remember which, like backports was enabled like right from the get-go, like pretty much on release day. Another one, I think it was over a month until backports was even created for the current stable release. And even then, there's no packages in there for many months. And I think one release didn't even have an updated kernel for over 6 months, but then another release had a kernel update pretty much right away. So you can't really depend on backports. It's good that it exists, but it's not I can't call it a solution because it's kind of hit or miss. They might have everything on there on release day. They may not. And there's other factors I won't get into that depends on that. So generally speaking, we're still talking about hardware compatibility at this point, because that's generally why you'd want to install a newer kernel. So those are the downsides. But again, Debian is a fantastic distribution. And I don't mean to talk down on it, because we have to owe it a debt of gratitude for everything that it's given us and the change and things that it's made in the industry. And like I said earlier, it is a good choice. So if you run Debian Stable on your server in your home lab and it works and supports your hardware, you will not regret installing it, in my opinion. So, so there's Debian.
Absolutely. And then
yep.
all the Debian derivatives, where do we start with those?
I think Ubuntu is probably one we could start with, because a lot of the derivatives are going to be desktop related, because you have MX Linux, which is fantastic, but that's, you could install it on the server. You're probably not going to. Ubuntu is kind of one of those things that's difficult to talk about, because I write books on it, obviously. So you could argue that Ubuntu is a source of income for me, but I'm not going to just also accept everything Canonical does and, you know, just pass it off as it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. If, you know, it deserves criticism, it's going to get criticism regardless. And I think one issue with, actually, I should talk about the upsides, actually, before I get on the rant podium there about Ubuntu. The good things. Let's talk about the good things. I should always start with the good things. Hardware compatibility is, in my opinion, the best in Ubuntu than any other distribution out there today. Now, that doesn't mean, and I know some people might say, well, Ubuntu doesn't work on my computer. That's correct. It may not. That doesn't imply 100%. It just means it's better. Not perfect, but better. And keep in mind, for the YouTube channel, I'm constantly trying computers, desktops, laptops, and installing Linux on all kinds of different things throughout my career. It's just Ubuntu generally works more often than other distributions. That in and of itself doesn't mean that it's going to really factor into Homelab much, because when we deal with servers, you know, we're probably not dealing with bleeding edge hardware anyway. But I do have to mention that hardware compatibility is a benefit. Well, how is it a benefit? Well, in order for me to tell you how it's a benefit, we have to talk about LTS or not, or non-LTS. I think that's the elephant in the room with Ubuntu. Like, should I use the latest and greatest, or should I use LTS? LTS stands for long-term support, which means you get 5 years of support on your servers, 3 years on your desktops. And well, what does that mean? What does support mean? Is Canonical going to allow you to call them on the phone when you have a problem? No. What it means is you get security updates, which is pretty important when you're hosting things, especially when you're, you know, making things publicly available. Non-LTS releases get 9 months of support, which means at a minimum, you have to upgrade your OS every 9 months if you're on that train. But with LTS, you can kind of keep your current distribution installed for a bit longer. And it kind of depends on how much time you have. If you don't have a lot of time to mess with your home lab, you might have to just go with LTS. But I argue that LTS is what everyone should go with, and not go with the intermediary releases. Now, that didn't used to be the case, because you would install the non-LTS releases to get newer software. But nowadays, they backport newer drivers and kernels to the current LTS release. So that reason alone has gone out the window, because now, even on a non-LTS release, you still are able to get the newer updated packages. And I think that's a major benefit. Now, I'm not going to talk about universal packages today, but they exist. We do have to mention them. And now that we have universal packages, which basically allow you to go outside of your distribution's repositories to install software, now you can have access to applications in your LTS release that you normally wouldn't have had access to unless you're using a non-LTS release. So more and more as time goes on, the LTS versus non-LTS, you know, debate, I feel like is really becoming not so much a debate anymore, because for the Ubuntu developers, intermediary releases are very important, because they're testing the next generation of technologies for the next LTS release. But for us, home lab and home users, I really don't see a benefit so much anymore in using something outside of LTS. And there's going to be counter arguments, but you know, that's my opinion.
I use
And,
Linux
yeah.
as my daily driver for both my laptop and desktop for my business. So this is I like it being stable. I have not had too many problems not running the LTS releases, but I'm also someone who's a little bit more savvy. But for a lot of people, if you don't have time to deal with it, just stay on that long-term service release, and I think you're pretty good. It's like you said, with them backporting some of the applications, it's made the debate less, because I would have argued before, well, don't you want the latest version of this, that, or the other? You kind of had to. Now they're kind of backporting thing, including some of the kernel updates and some optimizations. If they're deemed stable and beneficial enough, they will put them into a long-term release, and you'll see an update on that.
Yeah, and that's where it comes to for me. But when I asked, or I made the statement earlier that Ubuntu has better hardware support, and I said, how did they do that? Well, that's how they do it. They backport. That's
Yeah.
how they accomplish that. And their hardware enablement updates. Now, one downside is that it's not until the, I think, I'm trying to remember, the 0.2 or the 0.3 release, minor version release of an LTS release, we'll start to get those hardware enablement updates. I'm pretty sure it's the .2. So basically, you won't have that immediately available. So that could be an issue, right? If you have a piece of hardware right now and you really can't wait the 6 months or whatever it's going to be, then yeah, maybe you might be forced into using non-LTS because you're an edge case at that point. But that's how they do it. They backport things to the current LTS release, which is awesome. I think it's great that they do that. And I think that's what makes Ubuntu a game changer, in my opinion, for that, because it's not a perfect solution. There could be a race condition. When did you buy your hardware? When did Ubuntu put out their release? Maybe it's not going to line up so well, but there's a better chance of that lining up than with Debian, in my opinion. So that's a benefit there. Another thing that I think is a benefit is that Canonical, they really seem to understand and have a bigger role in the ecosystem. And you could argue that's a downside, but they do a lot to push Ubuntu in the cloud. So pretty much every cloud provider you can get an Ubuntu version, and yeah, you can get Debian too. But they also enable different things in their tool set. Like they have LXD. I think it's pronounced LexD, but I can't make myself say that.
No, it's LXC to me. I don't care who says otherwise.
Yeah. It's basically an advanced, without getting too much into it, it's an addition to LXC. LXC is a containerization technology. I think it's a great one, actually. LXD builds some additional things on top of that, and Canonical makes that a possibility. So you could take that, technology, and you have, more clustering and more options. And I think some of those features, if they haven't already done so, will be backported or moved into LXC. But they add all this to it, and they make it easy to install, like OpenStack and a number of other things. They have charms. They have all kinds of different tools that you can use. They have Metal as a Service even to spin up and provision your hardware. So they have all these tools that they make available, and I think will be of especially benefit to Homelab people. And Debian doesn't have that, right? You can still do all those things. You can still install OpenStack on Debian. Nothing's stopping you from doing that. But if you do that same thing on Ubuntu, there's a way to do it quicker. And whether you use that or not, it's still a benefit because Canonical adds these extra layers on top of Debian, which Ubuntu is based on Debian. So I think that's also a benefit, that they take the best of Debian, they kind of smooth out the edges a little bit, and then we all benefit from that. And now we get to the downsides. Oh boy. And like I said, even though Ubuntu and Canonical, because I wrote the books, obviously they're a big source of income for me. I'm not going to censor myself and not talk down on them, because when a company makes a bad decision, they make a bad decision, and they have made a few. A lot of people will remember back in the day when they put ads in the application launcher in Unity on the desktop. Now, that's not something Debian would have ever done, ever. Like, you could use Debian and never worry about that. In fact, you don't have to worry about a big corporation making a really dumb decision when you're using Debian, because it's a community project. That's not to say that there's not going to be things that happen in Debian that you don't care about or don't prefer. The whole systemd thing was a huge debate back in the day with Debian when that became default, and also the GNOME desktop becoming the default again, because it was technically the default twice. Strange, but true. So there's a little bit of controversy in Debian, but not nearly as much as Canonical, because they're a company, and they're going to serve their interest. And a company's purpose in life is to sustain itself and to produce an income. And it's perfectly understandable to me if someone doesn't really want to use a project or a product that is made by such a company, because what if they take it away from you? I'm not saying they will, or if they get bought out. What if Microsoft buys Canonical tomorrow? Well, do you care? Maybe. So there is that. But the dumb decisions that they've made, in my opinion, and I could say that because I feel like it is like putting ads in the application launcher to me. And I know this is a long time ago, they don't have that anymore, but I have to think like, I just can't think of a rational project manager inside a company doesn't understand that everyone's going to hate that. It's like, yeah, we'll release it. It's fine. Just like people, at Microsoft released Windows 8 with a straight face. But it's like, yeah, this is going to be great. Everyone's going to love it. No one's going to complain. Really? Um, Ads in
And
a app launcher? Really?
yeah, and Canonicals, I mean, they pushed it with the whole Unity thing when they were doing that. That was called, right? The whole, before they kind of went back to using no. What was that when they first released it? It was pretty controversial the way they
The
implemented that.
Unity? Are you referring to the Unity desktop?
Yeah, the way they
Yeah.
had some of their deviations, and of course the embedding of Amazon links or something that just made people unhappy. So
So I'm going to give you a so I mean, some of the counter argument to that is, well, they were smaller back then, and also a distribution's hard to maintain and expensive. I mean, if you just think about
yes,
it for a minute, what the bandwidth bill is on people downloading the ISO, it'd be great if people use torrents more because that takes some weight off of the servers. And people ask me, how can I give back to Linux? I don't have money to give, but I want to do something. Well, just make sure to use torrents all the time because you're stopping some of the bandwidth that they have to pay for. So you're technically donating money back to an upstream project by just using torrents. Well, I mean, unless that same server on their end is also serving the torrents, then it kind of defeats it. But
yeah,
um, getting back to Ubuntu, it's expensive, and someone might say, "Well, yeah, they got to make money somehow," and you could uninstall the package or do whatever you're going to do to disable it. Well, I agree. Yeah, they do need to make money, but there's more sensible ways of making money. And the perfect example, and I think Tom knows the one I'm going to use here, that happened to me personally on Ubuntu desktop is, as an aside, they had this app called Jockey, which I don't think has that same name anymore. It's just additional drivers. And it's great now because if you have Ubuntu on your desktop, you could just search for additional drivers in your applications. It's there. You click on it, and if there's a proprietary video card or something on there, or Wi-Fi card, whatever you have, it'll offer you to install it. Do you want me to install this proprietary driver? Yes. Click the button, and then it does it. So that naturally becomes the first thing I did when I installed Ubuntu because I had an NVIDIA card. So me being, the person that I am, I just type more than I click. So I just hit the super key and I go to the application launcher. I start typing Jockey because that then was the name of that additional driver's app. And you know how these application launchers work. Like if you're looking for Firefox, you start typing FI and it automatically knows, well, Firefox, meets that requirement. So it's going to narrow the list down to anything with FI. You type R and then, narrows it down more. So as I start typing Jockey, I see ads in the application launcher for jock straps. So I'm looking to install my NVIDIA driver, and I'm seeing underwear in my app launcher. So
yeah.
that was what I went through. And I think I wish I knew what video it was I mentioned this in because I mentioned this right in the video. Check this out. I'm going to search for Jockey underwear.
Yeah.
Not a good decision. And that's an example of something that would not happen in Debian. Let's be honest. They're not going to do something like that.
Right.
I
I think
do
I
agree they
was
need to make.
I was
Yeah,
more safe for work. I did the same demo, but I typed in calc and look, it's advertises for calculators. I actually just wanted to open up a calculator. It's like not buy one. Yeah.
right.
But yours is really on point. This was one of those heated debates and decisions that was made that was terrible over at Canonical. But that's so many years ago. We're really digging up something old. They haven't done
Right.
anything like that in quite a while, which has
They
been great.
haven't. And the reason why I bring up this old thing specifically is because the mindset hasn't changed. They made a number of other decisions I won't get into a long time ago, and they've removed those changes a long time ago. But the reputation is hard to get rid of. I mean, there's still people to this day that'll comment about the Linux Mint security fiasco, and they had that. I think it was a easy to guess password in their database server, and they got completely owned, and the ISO
Yeah.
images got owned as well. You know what? Forgiveness, right?
Yeah.
They learned a lesson. It's fine. But there's going to be people that remember that. There's going to, and I remember this particular instance because it's funny with the whole jockey thing, but there, there's people that'll think that's a downside, and maybe it is that that's a company that made that decision, but they've been fine. And they switched to GNOME from Unity. I think it's been great. They've done a lot of upstream work now for GNOME and improving it. A lot of the speed increases that GNOME has seen in other distributions even is because the canonical engineers have submitted patches to push those changes upstream, get rid of memory issues, and handle threading more efficiently. Everyone benefits from that. So there's a downside there potentially. Um, and then I think that's really the main downside, in my opinion, because I feel like Ubuntu, even though they've had some bad decisions, they're still kind of a victim of a mindset that won't change. Like even Microsoft is dealing with this, and even I still have some stigma against Microsoft, but they've done a lot with the open source community because they've really come around. And a lot of people didn't think that the Microsoft Loves Linux thing would last more than a few months. But here we are. I don't know how many years it's been now, and they're still on that.
Eh,
But the mindset's hard to change after a
yeah.
while.
Yeah, and they've been in. I mean, honestly, the real reason Microsoft loves Linux is because it turns out it runs in Azure really well, and they can monetize Azure. So Microsoft loves things they can monetize, and when
Right.
Linux was against their monetization model, they didn't love it. Now they've integrated into their monetization model, so now it's fun. It's a wonderful thing. We've never hated this, have we?
Yeah. Well, I mean, but I think the important thing to understand is, if any of us as people did something that we were sorry for, or did something that we said, yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm not going to do that again. We would want that forgiveness, right?
Yes.
But we're not so willing often as a species to give that forgiveness to a company. Yeah, Canonical made some bad decisions. You know what? Let's just see how they're doing now. And as time goes on, and they continue doing better things, then my confidence starts to
Right.
increase, or at least it should.
And companies, I think, are even easier to forgive than people sometimes because when you
Right.
really look at it, they exist in name that has continuation, but the people that drive that company may have been changed. It may change the dynamic of how that company operates. So they may still exist in name, but in purpose, so to speak, and intent, they've changed a lot with the people that maintain and are steering that company. But anyways, let's get back over to Linux
Let's get
because
back over to Linux and talk about
yeah,
some distributions. Now, CentOS is something that it's like the elephant in the room that we should talk about, but
yeah,
there's a lot of change around CentOS right now. And I don't want to get on that bandwagon because my current opinion is that it's really not something that I'd recommend anymore. But then again, I do understand there's definitely use cases for it. It's just that it used to be, and currently still is, but won't be for long, basically a clone of, not a clone, but a re-implementation of Red Hat, or basically it's a recompile of Red Hat without the branding. So
right.
rather than pay for a Red Hat, you can have the same thing, but you don't have the branding. And yeah, it's still that today, but they're moving away from that. Long story made short, I don't want to really get on that bandwagon.
Hmm.
So
You have a whole video on that topic, so
I think
easy to
what
find.
you should use it if it works for you. Um, there's no judgment there. If you are using CentOS because your company at work is a Red Hat company, then you probably want to use something that's Red Hat based. And that's been the benefit of CentOS for a very long time. Um, and now I think you can get a developer license of Red Hat for you to play around with, where you don't have to pay for it. I didn't look into the news yet, but I heard that was the case, so I'm going to assume it's true. It's a good thing. You can get Red Hat installed without paying for it if you're a developer. Again, don't feel free to fact check me on that. I need to do more research on it. That has changed, but it exists. But if your use case is that you want to use what work is using, well, maybe you should try to use Red Hat now and not CentOS if you can. But maybe you'll try CentOS Stream, which is what they're leading into, and maybe you'll love it, and maybe it'll work out for you. Or maybe you might look at Fedora Server or something like that instead. But I'm not really going to talk much about CentOS because I've never been much of a CentOS person. I have a lot of respect for it, but some of the pros, at least, were the fact that it works well with Red Hat and it's compatible, allows you to have a testing environment for your Red Hat servers, or even just run your servers on CentOS. And it also serves as the base for other distributions as well. I'm pretty sure Amazon Linux is based on it, if I'm not mistaken. So there's that as well. Downsides, before this whole fiasco, I would say hardware compatibility again, although I think it's gotten better. And I don't think they do that anymore. They used to really want you to install that desktop, but not so much anymore. And everyone just pretty much ignores it and installs minimal, which means command line. But CentOS is an option. You could try it in your home lab. You could see if it works out for you. If it's more in line to what you use at work or your style, then yeah, maybe it'll be a good choice.
Yeah, in CentOS, I would say it's just one more, and someone, in the comments throughout Rocky, there's a lot of different, RPM based distributions out there. It's kind of like there's two families, two big families. There's more, I know, but you have Debian based ones, which is Pop! OS, which I mentioned at the beginning, and Ubuntu. And then you have things that are RPM based or Red Hat based, essentially, or related deeply to Red Hat, that are going to be RPM based. So there's actually a lot of divergence in there. Between those two.
And then we have OpenSUSE,
Yeah.
or SUSE Enterprise Linux, which now share a lot of the same backend packages. I can't speak as intelligently about those because I haven't used them in quite some time. But I do plan on, when I get some more time, diving back into SUSE because there is a lot of good there. They are an RPM-based distribution. There are some people out there that are claiming that, we have Alma Linux and we have Rocky Linux as replacements for CentOS, which I'll get to in a minute. But some people argue SUSE is a good step in that direction. I don't know, maybe, maybe not. But one thing I can tell you, it was the case, and I have to assume still is because I haven't heard of this changing. I used to recommend SUSE to people that are a mixed shop, like you're at work, you have a Windows rack, you have a Linux rack, you want to tie into Active Directory. At one point, Microsoft was really helping out with that and bridging the gap, specifically in SUSE, in their tools to help it integrate with the Microsoft tools better. And I would recommend it to people in that situation, and no one that I've recommended it to ever came back to me and said, "How dare you? That was horrible. That was a train wreck." Nobody had any complaints, and they seemed to appreciate that recommendation. So I think I was right to recommend it. I do plan on diving back into it, like I mentioned. I don't know when. I'll have more opinions on it at that time, but I don't think anyone's going to be having a problem choosing SUSE, OpenSUSE, for their stack. I think they'll be fine with it. And there's a lot of people that really passionately love SUSE. So that's something to keep in mind too.
I've met a few of them at a couple events. They seem like really nice people. I always feel like it has a lot more popularity over in Europe than it does here in the United States. That's at least my impression of it. I just haven't run into it that often, except for a company. We have a couple of companies we worked with here that are based out of like Germany, and they seem to really like SUSE. That's the times I've run into it. They're companies operating in the U.S. that we've worked with, but they're based out of there. So, right. I'm much like you. I don't use it, so I can't speak a lot to it. The people seemed happy, and they said support was great, and I was like, cool. I'm just here to fix this thing.
I get the impression, I don't know if this is true, but it seems like CentOS, or excuse me, SUSE is to other countries as CentOS is to us here in the United States.
Yeah.
It seems that way, at least in some countries. So it definitely has a great following. But we have to be honest. I mean, SUSE has like probably one of the best benefits of all the distributions that I've mentioned that, we need to talk about. And that's the fact that it has a chameleon as the logo. Come on, how cool is that?
Yes, the branding.
It's the best thing ever.
And don't they
chameleon as the logo?
Aren't they the ones that release the videos that coincide with the releases?
I don't remember.
Yeah, they have that song. I think they call it Uptown Funk. They do parody videos.
Oh yes. That was when I was in my head. I was thinking about this video where they released a video about how to say SUSE, and it's literally just, I don't know how many minutes, somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes of people from all walks of life saying SUSE. And I don't think it was meant to be funny. Maybe it was. Maybe they have a dry sense of humor, but it was great, right? You had the video full of people just saying SUSE over and over again. So, and I Googled, earlier in my career, I don't know how long ago it was. How do you say SUSE? The video came up and I clicked on it. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah. So there's another advantage to SUSE. They have a whole pronunciation video, which is hard because most of the time I read things, and then until I started doing things on YouTube, I don't know how to say them in person. Linux conferences, when I first started going to them, were just a way to figure out how to say words sometimes. Like, what are you calling it again? Oh, we're talking about the same thing. We just say it differently, and because we've only talked about it online in forums.
Yeah, I don't want to be the person that says Debian. That drives me crazy. No judgment if anyone listening says it that way.
I was that person. I said it for a long time because I don't know. I knew someone else who said it, and no one else corrected me. And then I was like, "Oh, I'm saying it wrong."
Well, maybe, and you could argue the word devious is DE and then the letter and then I. I mean, same difference. But
Yeah.
another distribution that we can talk about, and I think a lot of people are going to be even like very surprised that I even brought this up, and that's Arch Linux. Right. And I don't want to play off the memes. I run Arch and all this other stuff. And yes,
but I
we
love
know
the memes.
I do too, though. It's a desktop distribution. I mean, it's not technically, but that's what most people use it for. I do legitimately feel that in the hands of the right administrator, somebody who has a way of managing it, that Arch Linux can be and often is a very good choice for servers. Now, that's going to be very surprising to a lot of people because it's a rolling release. It changes a lot every day. And server administrators, they really don't want to keep up with that. And I get it because everyone's busy and it's hard. But if you really think about it, you have to update Arch constantly thing is not true. You do have to update it at least once a month, probably every 2 weeks, install your updates. But there's this mindset you have to update every day. That is totally not true. And that's counter to uptime, right? I mean, everyone in the Linux community knows someone whose laptop has been online for 300 days straight and they're bragging about it. In Arch Linux is going to need to be rebooted more often because it changes more often. But all things considered, if you keep the packages that you've installed to a minimum, because you have full control over what packages you have installed, your margin of breakage is lower if you only have the packages that are absolutely required for the purpose of the server. For example, if you're running a web server, you don't want to have a desktop on there, right? You have only what's required to run Apache, Nginx, or whatever you're running, and that's it. So now you have fewer packages installed, and then the margin of error increases. Now, there's still a margin of error. Here's the problem. Now, my way of handling Arch has been install it on LVM and use LVM snapshots. And what I would do is update every 2 weeks. And then when I update, I'll take a snapshot before I update, an LVM snapshot. I'll install the updates. And then if something doesn't work, I'll revert the snapshot. And then I'll try it again a week later. Maybe they fixed it. It doesn't happen often where there's a breakage, but when it does, I'll give them a week. And then I'll try the updates again. Do they work now? Yeah, everything's great. So I'm going to finalize the snapshot and make it permanent because everything is great. And this is my known good server configuration with the packages that are installed right now. And then I'll repeat the process. Time to update, take an LVM snapshot, test it out. You could even do it on a test server first, which is probably a good idea anyway. The benefit of Arch, because a lot of people might be thinking, why would I go through all that? I'll just install Debian and install and updates when I feel like it. But the one benefit is that you don't have to worry about a new release. You just it's just a rolling distribution. You just keep updating, and you never have to have a situation. Oh, Debian 11 is out. I wonder what the update process is going to be like. And maybe I shouldn't have mentioned Debian because generally speaking, upgrades work well there. But I could say Ubuntu because there's going to be a bigger margin of error there. But still, I get it, right? You could make an argument in both ways, but I think Arch is worth considering. Yes, it's a lot more work, but if you do automation, which we'll get into in another video, you could automate your entire Arch install and it doesn't matter anymore. Or you could even have a very minimal base and run containers on top of it. And all the complexities in the containers, not in the OS. So there's just only a kernel and Docker and nothing else, and the required libraries to make that work. And that's it. There's no other packages to update because you're running containers. We'll talk about containers in the future.
Yeah.
Just throwing that out there.
I will also throw out there the Arch Wiki is solid. I have found a lot of just general Linux results for something I was trying to configure, something I should set up to find a parameter. And I was like, wow, the Arch Wiki had a really good write-up on the answer. They've just have a good set of documentation, which is Linux documentation. It's not specific to Arch. It's just a lot of like, here's all the parameters. Just they've done a good job of maintaining and curating really good information and good write-ups on how to change settings. I'm amazed how many times I'm looking up a parameter on a specific application or server application, and the Arch wiki will have the answer to the configuration for that, which is great.
And someone mentioned Manjaro, which I'm pretty sure I always say that wrong. A spin of Arch Linux that they have a little bit of a delay in a system in place. It's not a fail-safe system, but they're not as likely to just throw packages at you. They're going to hold it back a little bit and kind of wait a week or two or something like that. And also, if a lot of people are complaining about something, they might actually just say, okay, yeah, we're not going to update that right now. We're going to.
Nope, looks like we lost Jay for a second.
Oh yeah, I guess I must have dropped off. What was the last thing you heard me say?
Yep, you're back now. You said sometimes people like to update.
So in regards to Manjaro, which was mentioned there, just to try to make that short, it is an option you can consider. And I would argue too that because Manjaro has a delay in the updates coming to you, that in and of itself isn't much of a benefit because you can implement that same delay on your Arch system. It's just you don't have Manjaro forcing it on you. In the stable repositories, you could say, I will not update the servers, or I will wait 3 weeks for the packages before I put them in my server. You could control that, but that's an aside. Either way, it's an option. And someone also mentioned, well, wouldn't there be too many updates to keep track of? Well, yes and no. If you install everything but the kitchen sink, it's not unlikely in Arch you're going to have like 300 packages to easy.
Yeah, there gets to be just like a lot of updates when you're trying to do that. There just gets to be a lot of updates that can be problematic when they all come at once like that. I kind of wonder sometimes speculatively, like, what does it look like 10 years from now? Will rolling distributions at some point just become the way we do things? I kind of do see it as a future for things where we just constantly, and we're used to this on a lot of other devices, that they just constantly get updates. And sometimes that can expand out to the whole operating system where everything just kind of rolls. Like 20 years from now, we'll look back with grayer hair going, remember when those people needed version numbers on their operating system?
Yeah, I agree with you. I do predict, and I've said that before, not on the show, but I do think that's going to be the case. Now, first of all, I predict at some point that Ubuntu's non-LTS releases will become at least semi-rolling. Like Debian has testing, they freeze it, becomes a new release. Now Ubuntu releases every 2 years, no matter what for LTS. So I think that they would have a system where they're rolling in between that, and that gives people the latest stuff because the difference between LTS and non-LTS is blurring so much. It's like we get the new GNOME release, that's about it. We're not even getting that in this new one that's coming out. But I think the way I would like to see it in the future, because you could argue that rolling is too unstable because there's breakage. But what you could have is a base that rolls every 3 months. Your kernel, your drivers, they don't have to roll every day. You can have your base distribution core packages that makes your distribution boot and memory management and all that, and your virtualization tools on there. Just roll every 3 months. Then you could have a application repository that rolls every week because that gives you your latest Firefox and your latest Google Chrome. Well, actually, Google Chrome is a bad example, but your latest application packages in a separate, release or repository that's rolling faster because people want the latest browser. And then you could have the desktop environment rolls every 6 months because the new GNOME is out every 6 months. And then you have it kind of split up like that. So then you have varying levels of stability, and then corporations or organizations can change it, say, yeah, I don't want anything to, update unless it's security related for 6 months to keep it a little slower. But I do agree because even Windows 10 is kind of a rolling release now, if you think about it.
Well,
So
when they said Windows 10's the last version, they kind of meant it as in we're not naming other versions. They're still going to keep changing out under the hood. And I think there's something to be said
yep,
for the experience being better, that there's new versions coming out, but it doesn't require us reloading the whole computer like it's not Windows 11, 12, 13, and then you're reloading in the upgrade process. I mean, granted, yes, I know it's far from perfect and it does break. That's part of what I make a living on, but the concept is there. It may not be best implemented in the Windows example, but the concept is there, where you just change out some of the components, and some components in browsers being your biggest threat surface, they need to be updated almost
right.
in real time as threats come about or as flaws are found in a browser, because we interact with the internet as a whole directly through the browsers, and it's not the firewalls protecting us, it's whatever threat can sneak through by us opening up a web page. So there are components due to security, not just features, that need to be updated rapidly.
And I'm going to do something that I don't do often. I'm going to defend Windows, not from you or anything, but I'm actually good. I mean, because I think it's important, if even if it's not my preferred platform, that I call out something good. Yes, there's breakage because it's a rolling release technically, but how do organizations handle it? Or I should say, how should they handle it? Because just because Microsoft puts out the new version or the new update today with all the new features doesn't mean anyone has to install it today. Now, the downside for home users is it's probably going to try to install it. There's a way to make that happen slower, so you're not getting everything as quick. But it's interesting to me, like someone will say, "Oh yeah, Windows just deleted all my stuff." Well, that sucks, and it should never do that. That rule number one of an operating system is it should never delete your data, right? But I could also argue that just because it's available today doesn't mean that you should install it today. And companies will often have and I've seen this happen. They'll have a few people that are like, enthusiasts that work at the company. Like, hey, do you want to be on the get the updates first team or whatever they call it? And then they'll just be kind of like guinea pigs, just give them the newest version of Windows first. And then if they don't say that they've had any problems and it generally seems fine, they could graduate it to the next tier of users and the next tier of users. Problem is some people don't have time for that. But on a home user level, I mean, if everything was rolling, think about it. We have apt pinning. You mentioned that earlier, Tom. We have apt pinning in that, and that's
Yeah.
not going to go away. So if you have like, I use Caden Live for editing my videos, and I have a specific version, I don't want that to change right now until I vet it. Even though it's rolling, I could pin it. Don't change this. I want to keep this where it is, and then you can have control over that. And then all Ubuntu would have to do is put a GUI tool over it that you could check a box and lock a version.
Yeah.
You could absolutely have rolling all the things, and if it's done right, it could actually be a win.
I think it's funny. Someone might get the impression we're developers, or not developers, but content creators, because we've all complained about pinning development tools for creating media because it's crash worthy.
Some people will pin like versions of Python, or like I'll pin Ansible or something like that. It's good that we have that flexibility, but there seems to be this mindset that it's either completely rolling and bleeding edge or it's not. And I don't agree. I think it's often that way. Yes, in the real world, it doesn't have to be like that though. I agree. I don't think we need version numbers of distributions anymore. We could argue with LTS Ubuntu, that's fine. They release every 2 years. Why do we need a new release every 6 months, especially when not much has changed since the last one? I've released videos reviewing Ubuntu. Yeah, nothing much has changed. Not a whole lot to talk about here, and it's happened multiple times. So
Yeah,
why
there
do
was a
we
lot
still
of
have
fine
it?
tuning done, but no major sweeping changes between 6 months of versions. That happens a
Right.
lot.
Exactly. So did we leave out any distributions? I feel like there's an elephant in the room that we didn't cover that's just glaring me right in the face. I know we've covered I know we didn't talk about Fedora much, but that's generally not run on servers as often, even though they do have a server version. It's not very
Yeah, I think
popular
we
for some
covered.
reason.
I mean, there's always all the little offshoots. So you can go to Distro Watch and have a heyday of how many distributions there are, which creates a little bit of confusion. Which is also something that if you're new to Linux, you're like, hold on, it seems really important because there's 50 different options. That must mean there's 50 different choices, and now I don't know where to start. We'll cap it off with this. Probably Ubuntu is a great place to start. I think you probably share my opinion in that. For
I would say Debian or Ubuntu is pretty much interchangeable for Homelab people. The only thing I would say there to differentiate those two is if your hardware is new, Ubuntu. If it's not new, hand me down, secondhand server, Debian or Ubuntu is fine. If you want to leverage any of the additional tools that Ubuntu has, you can go with Ubuntu. But either if you take all that out of there, Debian and Ubuntu are practically interchangeable if hardware compatibility isn't an issue.
Yeah, and you may have a book on this topic where they can dive into and get your book at
I do.
learnlinux.tv. I'll give you a plug for that
Yeah.
if you want to go
And
through and
Mastering
learn some of
Ubuntu
this.
Server third edition is available at ubuntuserverbook.com. I made an easy alias for that if you want to check that book out. And Debian fans, I do have a Debian review coming out tomorrow on my channel. Should be up by around 9 a.m. if you want to check that out. It's going to be a fun review of Debian, so don't miss this one. So there's that. And
Yeah,
yeah.
and you've already reviewed Arch, and we both have covered Pop OS. I've even talked. I didn't dive into it, but I mean, I know people really like the desktop environment, which we didn't dive deep into. But I have topics like KDE Neon on my channel. So if you like the KDE desktop environment,
Yep.
I've reviewed it. I think you reviewed it too, haven't you, Jay?
I did, and I liked it better than Kubuntu, and I haven't checked it out lately. Kubuntu is the KDE edition of Ubuntu, and I came away thinking like, wow, KDE Neon is great actually. Why
Yeah.
would I want to use Kubuntu at this point? Because KDE Neon, and unless it's changed, if it's still the case now, I think it's a great distribution for that.
Right. And we'll have a separate episode where we just talk about desktop environments, because no matter which one of these distributions you chose, the desktop environment bolts on to the top of it. So that becomes a choice. This is one of those things that once you start getting into Linux, you realize the distro you choose will change the nuance of the package manager, but doesn't really change that much. If you wanted to run the KDE or GNOME on either a RPM-based distribution or something that's based on the apt system, you can do that. So
Yep.
that'll be a whole nother show and a whole nother topic.
And another thing about that too is that you brought up a good point. A lot of people will ask, like, what should I learn on? Well, I mean, let's just think about it for a minute. If we take the package manager out of the equation, the ls command has all the same options on all the distributions, right? You cd into different directories. If you install Vim or Nano or whatever your text editor of choice is, it's generally speaking going to be the same on each. So there's a ton of carryover from one distribution to another. It's not until you get into the package manager or the desktop stuff or the version of the kernel that it starts to change. But you'll be well served by any of those distributions, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot you can do with all of them. So it's not, yeah, that's why I don't want to get people like thinking that if you use Ubuntu, that's only GNOME or anything like that, or GNOME's the only desktop environment. But like I said, we'll have to do that as a entirely diving into, because we could talk another 2 hours about desktop environments, but we have to wrap it up at some point.
Yeah, and a few quick things because there's some questions here. Someone asked about the PinePhone review. It didn't work out. I'm gonna probably try it again, but I bought the one that had the dock, so you can have it, desktop environment on there. And I can't capture any screen footage because that has never worked. I'm going to check it out again, just kind of dusted it off. I chalked it up to a failed project, but I might actually dust it off again. It's been sitting around, so I may as well do something with it. Have you seen any questions on there?
Yeah, I think there was a question about gaming on Linux. That, again, would have to be its own topic, but that is a big challenge. As much as companies are slowly working towards things in Proton and all the different options, yeah, we do know that games are sometimes what keeps people, especially some of these games with the online play with anti-cheat options. That anti-cheat option I know breaks inside of Linux that there's not always a workaround for. So yeah, I do understand and feel your pain on that. Jay does too. My Windows gaming system, that's where I do run Windows.
I'm of the opinion on that, though. I know this is not going to be a popular opinion, but it is my opinion. I just don't think it matters as much as people think it does. And here's why I feel that way, because when I was a kid, stupid analogy alert, I had a Sega Genesis, and I fully understood that my Super Mario World cartridge would not fit in the Sega Genesis, right? So I knew that there was a library of software for the Genesis and a library of software for the Super Nintendo. You picked one, and despite your friend having this awesome game that you can't play because you didn't choose that system. You just had to deal with it because you can only have one. So I guess I don't always understand the concept that Linux should run software that it was never designed to run, software that was never designed to run on it, and that being a downside of Linux. And I totally get it. If you're a gamer, the choice might be made for you, possibly. We could talk about this in more detail later, but I don't feel there should be any requirement, perceived or real, that an operating system is supposed to run software it was never meant to. Linux is
Right.
Linux, Windows is Windows. If you can get it to work, and I encourage you to try because that's part of the fun. If it doesn't work, I'm going to force it to work. Then your oppositional defiance kicks in, and you really want to make that software work. It's not even about playing the game anymore. You just want to force it to work to show that you can and brag about it. I totally get it. But if you get it running, then even great, even better. But that's, again, probably a whole other video.
Yeah. And something that came up a few times in the comments that I don't like when people think this is the solution. Like, how do I get my entire office of 500 end users to use Linux? You just don't. It's not a likely scenario. The cost of retraining people, the confusion it creates by having a different operating system, Windows is still the winner, so to speak, in the desktop environment of the general business office. Now, if you have a team of developers, maybe, but it kind of goes back to the gaming thing where, like Jay said, trying to get Linux to run that, a lot of the tools, like, okay, let's say an AutoCAD office or an office using a bunch of Microsoft Office tools, they are going to be best suited to run, and the tooling and everything in the Active Directory world, in the tooling that runs on there that's all based on Windows products, trying to get those through compatibility layers working would be so much more support. And this is what the reason people ask is like, well, isn't Linux more secure? Not exactly a one-to-one here when you're talking about that. Are there less viruses for Linux desktop environments targeted at end users? Yes, because there's less users. But once you give a bunch of end users the ability to click and run things with some admin privileges, the problem will start right back up again. So it becomes like, it's a kind of a complicated topic that's not as black and white as people think it. It's not a binary answer of Linux better than Windows, and this is how you solve it. And this is one thing, you know, both of us do spend time working in corporate world, even if it's at an IT service level, so we understand that you can't just flip a switch and swap these out, and it's not as easy as that. So
And I agree completely, but I also feel like I don't like the all or none mentality. If you think about it, like if I was to like purchase another dumb analogy, but if I was going to purchase an auto mechanic shop that had like 12 mechanics working there, and on the first day I come in and say, you are all going to use this brand of wrench, I guarantee you they're going to laugh me right out of the shop floor.
Yep.
They're not going to, not for a minute. They're going to use the tools that they use to do their job the best. Each individual employee is going to have their preferred, tools for their job, and they're going to be happiest when they're using the tools that they prefer to use. I think the goal might be to help handle mixed environments better, so that you blur the line, so someone can use that Mac and someone can use that Windows laptop or that Linux computer, and your systems and security and authentication, LDAP, whatever you're using, understands how to differentiate itself based on the platform would be a better goal, in my opinion.
And as far as how the future looks, I've commented this many times. There's not really any startups making their new killer application to run only on Windows. All the new applications pretty much are focused on being web enabled without a local install. Now, this excludes things like security or tooling applications that help. Those are assistive applications. But like the next version, even Microsoft with Microsoft Office, or Google's been there for a long time with G Suite, things that are more browser based are huge because they suddenly take the operating system environment out of it. You build a single sign-on method. So we're seeing changes in the software industry that's making the desktop a little bit less relevant for the masses. The specific users, we still have our power user use cases, and doing that in the cloud is not going to happen anytime soon. But for the masses, this is what allows work from home. They log on through single sign-on to a handful of applications, and now they just do everything through essentially a browser, because browsers are calling a browser. It seems like they need a new term, because you can run Doom in a browser. They're full of their operating systems almost into themselves.
They totally are, and it's also kind of bringing up a very uncomfortable truth for me, but it's still a truth nonetheless. Like you said, the operating system layer is mattering less and less. It's a very slow decline. It's going to take many years. But, I have Learn Linux TV is my YouTube channel name. I mean, 10 years from now, however long, I could reach a situation where the line is blurred so much, I might even have to change the name of the channel if it comes to that. But probably
Learn browser
won't.
TV.
No. Learn computers TV. I don't know. But
Yeah.
the industry will change the way it's going to change. And I agree. It's like our operating system is a way to get a browser on our screen or to run a virtual machine for development, essentially.
Right.
So
hopefully this answered some of your Linux questions. Feel free to leave some comments below. And thank you. Anything more? You have anything else, Jay? I think we covered it all. I don't want to.
I do have one more thing. Actually, I forgot to mention this. We mentioned, I think it was the last episode where you had, or maybe the one before that, you had a tip about using a KVM for the for like gosh, I'm blanking on the name of that Tiny Pilot for the Tiny Pilot solution. And you mentioned just putting a KVM on that. I got an email actually from the developer, the lead developer there. He says that won't actually work because he says it's being presented as a USB on the go hub, and it's not going to send the proper signals through. I don't completely understand it, but he did say there is one that works. But I just want to make sure no one's going to buy a Tiny Pilot and putting a KVM on it. I do recommend the Tiny Pilot. It's great.
Yeah,
but
you just had a review of that, and I'll have a review soon of it too. So
right.
I think we covered all the major stuff here.
I think we have. But that was someone sent the email over, so I wanted to send it out there.
So you can find each of us on our respective channels. LearnLinux.tv is where you can find Jay and all of his stuff, and all my stuff is over here on this channel and at LawrenceSystems.com. Thanks again for joining us on this podcast, and see you next time.